three speakers. We have Dr. Andrey Rosowsky of the University of Sheffield. We have with us also Dr. Vally Lytra from Goldsmiths, University of London, and from the Federal University of Goiás, Dr. Ana Souza. Sejam bem-vindos ao Seminário Multilinguismo em Contextos Religiosos. Temos conosco hoje Dr. Andrey Rosowsky, da University de Sheffield, doutora Vally Lytra, da Goldsmiths, University of London, e doutora Ana Souza, da Universidade Federal de Goiás. As you can see, we are going to be doing our seminar in a bilingual mode, in both English and in Portuguese. We are going to have three presentations. Each one will last 20 minutes. At the end of these three presentations, we will have a question and answer period. And so if you have questions that you would like to make, please put them in the chat. They can be written down in English or in Portuguese. Como vocês podem ver, nós teremos o nosso seminário tanto em português quanto em inglês. Teremos 3 apresentações, cada um de 20 minutos, e após essas apresentações, teremos um período de perguntas e discussão. Se vocês têm perguntas para fazer, por favor, coloquem no chat. Podem ser colocados tanto em inglês quanto em português. Nós vamos iniciar nossa primeira apresentação com o Dr. Andrey Rosowsky, e eu vou fazer uma pequena apresentação sobre ele. Dr. Andrey Rosowsky is a senior lecturer in the School of Education at the University of Sheffield, United Kingdom. Andrey's research interests include language and education, sociolinguistics, multilingualism, and faith-based complementary schooling. His publications include Faith and Language Practices in Digital Spaces, Multilingual Matters, 2017, and The Performance of Multilingual and Ultralingual Devotional Practices by Young British Muslims, Multilingual Matters, 2021. Dr. Andrey Rosowsky é Senior Lecturer na Escola de Educação da University of Sheffield, no Reino Unido. A pesquisa do professor inclui língua e educação, sociolinguística, multilinguismo e escolas religiosas complementares. Suas publicações incluem Faith and Language Practices in Digital Spaces, Multilingual Matters, 2017, e The Performance of Multilingual and Ultralingual Devotional Practices by Young British Muslims, Multilingual Matters, 2021. Passo a palavra agora para Dr. Andrey Rosowsky. Andrey, you have the floor.
Thank you, Dilys. And I'd just like to say thank you as well to the Federal University of Goiás and to Anna for inviting me to speak at this very interesting seminar. Now, as the title suggests of my presentation, this is going to be, if you like, a terminological discussion about terms. I recognize that there's a sort of a fuzzy link between terms and concepts and ideas. So it's sort of it is theoretical as well. But I know many people feel anxious often about theory. I know I do. So I feel much more comfortable talking about this as a terminological issue, although I recognize that it is also a theoretical one. So this is a seminar about multilingual practices in religious spaces. And when we talk about multilingual spaces in general, the sociolinguistic concept of a linguistic repertoire is very important. You know, the range and variety of languages and language varieties that are used by individuals and by communities. And when we talk about a religious context, then there is a particular linguistic repertoire for those spaces as well. And very often, one of the language varieties that he's actually used as part of the linguistic repertoire is a language variety which has had a number of different names. Joshua Fisherman calls it a religious classical. Brian Bennett calls it a sacred language. I myself have called it a liturgical language or a liturgical literacy. And this language variety is fairly universal and is found in most of the world's major faiths. In Islam, in Christianity, particularly in the Orthodox versions of Christianity, and of course in the Catholic Church before 1962, where Latin was the, if you like, the sacred variety. But it's also found in other world religions such as Buddhism and Judaism, and I'll be referring to some examples from Judaism a bit later. Fisherman himself, in his 1989 publication, included quite a long list of these particular varieties, including Lutheran German, which is used by the Amish today, Ecclesiastical Greek, and Egyptian Coptic, which is still used by Egyptian Christians. And these are all examples of this particular variety that you find that is often found in multilingual religious repertoires. And millions, literally millions of children attend supplementary schools all over the world for the purpose of acquiring their sacred language. But what sort of a language is it? What sort of language is this? I'm going to talk about it in three ways, really. First of all, the form. Invariably, the sacred language or the religious classical is an archaic language. It's often derived, or nearly always derived, from the written form, a sacred text, and so on. And because of its archaic nature, it's often very linguistically distant from the spoken vernaculars of the participants of today. And that linguistic distance can be because either the language is a different language to the language spoken by the participants, or it's a variety of that language which was used maybe hundreds or even 1,000 or more years ago. So that linguistic distance is created by time rather than place, as it might be if it was a different language. And of course, that linguistic distance is very important to what I'm going to be talking about here, because that linguistic distance, that lack of familiarity, leads often to a regular absence of referential meaning, propositional meaning, the understanding of what the words or the phrases actually might mean from a literal point of view. So that's the form, really. The function is invariably is used for devotional purposes, such as prayer or recitation, other ritual. The domain, as with most religious practice, it has a private, it has a public domains, places of worship, obviously, and also the associated places of learning, where people learn the sacred language. And obviously today, in today's world, more and more of this sacred language practice takes place online. Couple of examples here just include, for example, Muslim children learning how to read the Quran, and Jewish children learning how to read the Torah. And in each example, it is assumed that the young Muslim or the young Jewish child isn't a speaker of the language of the sacred text. So the majority of Muslims in the world are not Arabic speakers. Okay, the majority of Jewish children in the UK are not Hebrew speakers; they are English speakers. So that's the distance we're talking about, that I've been talking about. So how did I get involved in this? A little bit about my own background. I've sort of been carrying out an ethnography that's going on now, getting on for 20 years, into Islamic devotional practices in communities in the north of England. And one of the objectives of that ethnography really has been to modify or challenge prevailing discourses that those language practices, those sacred language practices, are somehow deficient or somehow limited to rote learning. In other words, a mechanical sort of form of language practice. So I was interested in sort of challenging that particular prevailing view. But that negative, if you like, that negative discourse has been around for a long time. So my examples here are Calvin writing in the 16th century, referring to Matthew 6, with this expression of vain repetitions, which was a criticism of Jewish language practice by Christians at the time. We have the philosopher Berkeley talking in the 18th century here about sort of simple peasants going along to Sunday service and not understanding what was happening in the Latin service. MacDonald and Zerdumi are two people who have actually researched into Islam and have come up with very sort of negative comments about the mechanical nature or the absent-minded nature of a lot of this language practice. But that's in the past. But more recently, we've had research carried out by Cherty and Bradley, which was a report into UK Islamic supplementary schools, which came up with very, very similar conclusions. So as I've been doing the research, I've been sort of conscious that there was something more to it than just absent-minded recitation or reading. And the work of Richard Bauman has helped me a lot, and particularly his work on performance. Now, a lot of his work focusing on performance is mostly in secular contexts rather than religious contexts, but he articulated a view that a great deal of the language practices that take place in a performance mode lend themselves to an understanding beyond the referential meaning of whatever's being recited. So his focus was on things like storytelling, on poetry recitation, on scripts and actors, and he was able to show through some really sort of through much of his research that there was something beyond the actual words that were spoken. So he said that there was an emphasis on the externals of the utterance, in other words, of getting it right, of accurate pronunciation, of following certain conventions in terms of recitation, of rhythm and rhyme. In other words, this concentration on the form of the language or the utterance in this case is something that gives an enhanced experience. And he uses this word, enhanced experience. So some of the comments here from some of my young participants over the years sort of refer to various aspects of that. So in terms of when asking children, what are you experiencing when you are reciting in a sacred language? And for example, here somebody is very conscious of the fact that Arabic is what they're reciting, and Arabic is a very significant language for them because it's associated with heaven. And there are other sort of associations that children have when they are reciting, which aren't necessarily directly related to the words that they're reciting, but it's sort of a meaning beyond whatever they're saying. There's also quite a lot of attention paid to the meta language, if you like, of wanting to know if what you're reciting, you're doing it properly. You know, are you reciting and pronouncing things in the correct way? And that's a very important part of religious classical practice about being accurate and being and being faithful, if you like, to the original. And again, the last one, thinking about the future and so on. I mean, these are quite interesting comments coming from children that points to something a little bit more significant than what Del Hymes calls something perfunctory. Now, an added sort of dimension to sacred language practice is its links to identity. And here we have, from a different tradition, from the Jewish tradition, 2 quotes from teachers who actually have been, who are asked about what is the, you know, what is their attitude, or what is their attitude, what is their children's attitude, or their young learners' attitude towards learning the sacred language of Judaism, which is biblical Hebrew, which is a language in this case which they do not understand, do not speak, but they see it very much as part of their identity as Jewish children, or as Jewish people in general. So links between that and identity are very important. Now, so so what I've come to, and what this presentation is about really is how do you capture that particular experience? What is that language practice that's happening? And over the years, I and others have used sort of paraphrases to sort of try to communicate what that is. Either reading as decoding, for example, is quite a common one. Reading as performing, obviously within the Bauman tradition. But such paraphrases don't really capture or the range of experiences that such sacred language practice includes, because we're not talking just about reading. We're talking often about singing. We're talking about memorizing. We're talking about chanting, and equally important, there is an aural, an enhanced aural dimension. So we're not just talking about participating and producing language when we take part in language practice. There's also about experiencing it from the point of view of a listener. And in this quotation here, again, I won't go through the whole quotation, but the underlined aspects of that focus on how the sound of the Hebrew read by the cantor or the choir in the synagogue, the actual speaker says that how that, without necessarily referring to meaning, sort of washes over them, sort of becomes an experience, an aural experience, which has great significance for them, talking about the spirit soaring as they listen to the sound of the Hebrew, which they don't necessarily understand. And that's very much part of what I'm trying to get at here, and about meaning that's beyond the actual referential meaning of words and so on. So that's led me to thinking about, well, what can we call this? So ultra, here's a word, a Latin word, obviously, a suffix that actually means about pointing to or denoting something which is beyond. You know, an obvious example from the physical world is ultraviolet. Except that in the normal physical world, you can't see ultraviolet. So that's the whole point, that it's beyond what you can see unless you have the right instruments. So ultraviolet is an example from the physical world. I haven't found really much evidence of its use in language. And so I've made a few references in my latest book, which sort of indirectly, I guess, touches on this notion of beyond. For example, Sneller uses the word ultralingual to explore how Derrida, for example, explores meaning in Abulafia's Scribal Oddities. A medieval manuscript in Arabic would have margins, and people would write things in the margins, like commentaries on what's actually in the text. And so what Sneller was saying, that Derrida was actually looking at these marginal comments as a way of pointing beyond the words of the text that are in the middle. Music seems to be closely associated with what I would call an ultralingual experience, where words are sung, but meaning often lies elsewhere. And there's a quotation here: one of our strongest ultralingual means of establishing human connection and mutual understanding across borders, culture, and class is music. And these are examples, if you like, secular examples of what I'm talking about. Although curiously, they sort of turn back on into something sacred, or at least something spiritual. Some of you may know of the British composer Carl Jenkins, whose his most famous choral work is Adiemus, which, as you can see from the title, it looks like, and when you hear it, it sounds Latin, but of course it isn't. And there is no meaning to the words that are actually part of this famous hymn. People have tried to discover what it might mean, but really the words have just been put together. But when people listen to it, and if you look at below the line comments on the YouTube version, you will see how people talk about it as being, this sounds very spiritual. The theme tune from Gladiator, sung by Lisa Gerrard and composed by Hans Zimmer, similar. It sounds, if you listen to it, sounds quite Hebrew, actually. There's lots of sh sounds in it as well. And of course, people will also say similar things. Very moving, very emotional, very, very spiritual. Again, the words mean nothing in a referential sense. And then in poetry is quite a common sort of place where people would say that the meaning of a poem lies outside of the actual literal meaning of the words that you actually you read or you recite. And and that's just an example from what's been said about Jalaluddin Rumi, the famous Persian poet, that somehow his work expresses an experience of love which is beyond the actual discursive sense of the words. So ultralingual practices then, I think, or using the term ultralingual, it's a challenge, I think, to those pejorative and deficit associations such as rote learning or vain repetitions. I think I'm arguing, I'll be very interested to see what your views are. I'm arguing that there's a more dynamic link, I think, between language and meaning stroke experience is established. Meaning experience which is beyond, which is ultra, referential and propositional meaning. Ultralingualism is not a term like multilingualism. I mean, you can't be an ultralingual individual or an ultralingual community. Rather, it's a language-generated experience produced by an understanding that what is uttered, what is sung, what is recited, what is heard, points to an experience, something beyond. And much sacred language practice is like this, both when acquiring the language or when using it for devotional purposes. It is essentially ultralingual. And just to finish off, just an example, when a Muslim child, for example, cannot articulate the meaning of the words of the most basic Islamic prayer, which is known as the Fatiha, the opening, but still can experience its form and sound, can recognize its spiritual value and its dynamic role in his or her identity, then that individual child is being ultralingual. Okay, and I'll end there. I'll be very interested in getting questions or comments later on.
Thank you, Dr. Andrei. Very interesting. We are now going on to our second presenter, who is Dr. Vally Lytra. She is a reader in languages and education at Goldsmiths, the University of London. Vally's research interests focus on multilingualism, language and literacy teaching and learning in schools, homes, and community contexts that have experienced diverse migration flows. Her publications include Religion in Young Lives, Navigating Language, Literacies, and Identities, edited with colleagues, Routledge 2017. Doutora Vally Lytra é Reader in Languages and Education na Goldsmiths, University of London. A pesquisa da professora focaliza multilinguismo, ensino e aprendizagem de línguas e letramento em ambientes de escola, do lar e em contextos que vivenciaram fluxos migratórios. Suas publicações incluem Religion in Young Lives, Navigating Language, Literacies and Identities, editado com colegas, e publicado por Routledge em 2017. Dr. Vally, you have the floor.
Thank you, Dilys, for this introduction, and thank you, Anna, for this very kind invitation. It's a great pleasure to be with you today, virtually, at the Federal University of Goiás. So before moving into the more conceptual discussion of my presentation, which has to do with how a syncretic lens can provide a window to the conceptualization, to the exploration of faith literacies and identities, I would like to start by saying a few words about how I came to the study of faith literacies and identities in children's lives. So from 2009 to 2013, I was part of a team of 11 researchers investigating how 16 children aged between 4 and 12 at the beginning of the work, the field work, from Bangladeshi Muslim, Ghanaian Pentecostal, Polish Catholic, Tamil Hindu communities developed their language and literacy learning through faith activities in London. This project, entitled Becoming Literate in Faith Settings, Language and Literacy Learning in the Lives of New Londoners, was a 3-year multi-sited team ethnography spanning across 3 social spaces: places of worship, religious education classes, and children's homes. As project team members, we shared different linguistic, cultural, and ethnic backgrounds, age, gender, professional and educational circumstances, religious and non-religious beliefs. Anna was also part of our project team. We developed a case study approach, working in 4 research pairs, where a new researcher, who was a member of the ethnolinguistic community, was paired with a more senior research partner who was not. In my case, I was paired with Arani Ilankuberan and worked with children of Tamil Hindu Saiva heritage and their families. Our project was driven by the growing recognition of the enduring significance of faith in shaping the everyday lived experiences of many children and adults as they strive to navigate increasingly multilingual, multicultural, multi-ethnic, and multi-faith societies worldwide. Often considered as a very private matter, the centrality of faith in many people's lives is frequently pitted against dehumanizing representations or misrepresentations of faith communities, and it's particularly the case in media discourses. Additionally, within educational research, which is my area of study, children's faith literacy learning is frequently ignored or rendered problematic, especially in relation to school literacies. And this links back to Andrei's comment about the disparaging comments around rote learning and repetition in educational research. So in this context, a fundamental question that has shaped our research has been, how do children draw upon diverse faith contexts to shore up their identities, belief systems, languages, and cultural traditions in a post-secular world? To address this question, we have used the following orienting theories. We start with an understanding of faith and as an essential part of culture, a cultural practice that is socially and historically situated, embedded in specific local and global contexts. Conceptualizing faith as cultural practice examines faith and social activity in people's histories of participation in faith activities and rituals. This conceptualization of faith is in line with an understanding of literacy as sociocultural practice that highlights the interconnections between processes within the individual and the social world, that is, the social, cultural, historical, and ideological dimensions of literacy practices. We also draw on recent scholarship on the syncretic nature of children's faith learning. Our work builds upon earlier work by Durante and Oakes within the Samoan American community in urban Los Angeles. The authors introduced the notion of syncretic literacy, defined as intermingling or merging of culturally diverse traditions that informs and organizes literacy activities. In cross-cultural encounters, they argued, one cultural system rarely simply replaces another one. Rather, social actors may include incorporation of any culturally diverse values, beliefs, emotions, practices, identities, institutions, tools into the organization of literacy activities. In the 2004 edited book, Pathways to Literacy, Young Children Learning with Siblings, Grandparents, Peers, and Communities, Gregory, Long, and Volk extended this conceptualization of syncretic literacies to foreground the creativity, intentionality, and transformative potential of literacy learning. As children actively intertwine diverse cultural threads from home, community, and school knowledge and experience, sometimes this intertwining happens in harmonious and other times in contradictory ways into a single interactional fabric to create something new. The syncretic nature of children's faith learning is thus understood as a creative process in which people reinvent culture as they draw on diverse resources, both familiar and new, focusing on the activity of transformation. Exploring cross-cultural encounters through a syncretic lens foregrounds how children may reconcile and build upon cultural practices from diverse contexts, as well as the contradictions, clashes, and tensions arising out of these encounters. Our understanding of the constitution of identity, of faith identities, is premised on the view of identities as multiple and relational, negotiated and performed in discourse and through social and embodied behavior in everyday interactions. Identities are thus understood as processes rather than as product, as something we do rather than simply something we are, as social actors use their meaning-making resources to take up, foreground, downplay, or resist particular identity dimensions and position themselves and others in particular ways under particular conditions. These negotiations partly reflect human agency while recognizing that institutional, social, political, and historical forces and processes can create and constrain possibilities for identity performances. At the same time, we're cognizant that static and essentialized notions of faith and faith identities are important. They're often associated with individual and collective projects of linguistic and cultural maintenance in response to assimilationist and discriminatory policies and practices. Indeed, our theoretical orientation may be at odds with how children, parents, faith teachers, faith leaders, and other community members may at times reify or romanticize faith identities by stressing, for instance, the intimate link between language, ethnicity, and religion. Rather than regarding fixed and fluid orientations as mutually exclusive, we view them as mutually contingent. This means that we attend to how and under what conditions children orient to and perform fixed and fluid orientations as they negotiate religious belonging. I would like to move on and provide an illustration of how we applied these theoretical perspectives in the examination of children's faith-inspired texts and talk. While we recognize the central role of language in both oral and written form in sustaining, developing, and spreading faith literacy practices, a syncretic lens goes beyond an exclusive focus on language and the interrelationship between languages. It investigates how languages are entangled with broader communicative repertoires of everyday cultural practices, material and symbolic resources. And I think in this way, there's a link to the ultralingual practices that Andrei was talking about earlier. We argue that a syncretic lens can be enriched with an explicit focus on the examination of children's faith-inspired texts and talk as processes of identity exploration. Following Pahl and Rosell, we understand children's faith-inspired texts as material objects that combine words and images and are tied to individual, familial, and collective narratives. Moreover, children's texts can open possibilities for the rehabilitation of memories, stories of journeys, and for new understandings. This conceptualization of children's faith-inspired texts examines processes of identity formation from a moving and provisional perspective, as a process of becoming that is at times open-ended and potentially unpredictable. A key concern of our research team was a commitment to ensuring that the voices of the children were not simply heard, but they actively shaped the co-production of our ethnographic narratives. To this end, we used visual and multimodal research methods, and in particular, the creation of scrapbooks alongside more traditional ethnographic methods. At the beginning of the second year, we gave each key participant child an A4 size scrapbook with multicolored pages and asked children to write, draw, and stick what they considered important about their faith and they wanted to share with the researchers. Following the completion of the scrapbooks at the end of the year, researchers engaged in conversations with the children about their text making. The purpose of these conversations was to explore with children the process of creating their scrapbooks, their decisions and intentions. And you can browse through the children's scrapbooks on the project website, www.beliefs.co.uk. So by way of example, I will share with you one particular scrapbook entry, which consists of the drawing of a column on the left-hand side, accompanied by an explanatory text on the right-hand side. And the talk about this entry that followed between the two children who created the scrapbook and Arani Ilankuberan. Columns are a form of intricate geometric line drawing created on the threshold of one's home in the early morning before sunrise or before sunset. And this is a cultural practice that occurs in many parts of South India and to a less extent in Sri Lanka. Columns were used to adorn the children's scrapbooks. And the images of columns revealed a familiarity with this art form in this transnational community. Here I've chosen to share with you the example of a column designed by one of the older children, Santhuru. Santhuru, who was 12 years old when we started our project, and his sister Chanthia, 9 years old, were born and brought up in London. The children and the family are part of the growing Sri Lankan Tamil Hindu communities in East London. So drawing on the rich visual image of Hinduism, mediated via new technologies, Santhuru explained to Arani that he used a guide from the internet to create his column. Santhuru's representation of the column combines geometric shapes with different colors to create a symmetrical drawing. The drawing is characterized by precision and complexity, and it's accompanied by an explanatory text in English. In the accompanying text entitled column, followed by the word in Tamil script, Santhuru wrote, and I quote, "Tamil people decorate the parts of their houses with kolam, which is designed using rice flour in different colors. Most people decorate their houses during the Diwali festivities. The religious significance of placing kolam patterns is so that humans are ensuring there is food for the smaller creatures of the world, such as ants. For this reason, the person placing the kolam must make sure that the rice flour they use is edible, as otherwise many creatures would die." In his text making, Santhuru brings together diverse cultural threads from home, community, and school knowledge and experience to combine and layer meaning. Using the affordances of the school genre of the explanatory text, he unites the aesthetic and the affiliational with the symbolic, spiritual, and practical significance of drawing a column. First, he invokes Tamil ethnicity and how it is manifested in the cultural practice of drawing a column to decorate the path of one's house. The invocation of Tamil ethnicity exemplifies the strong link between Tamil culture, ethnicity, and religion that repeatedly emerged in our case study and has been documented by other scholars too, such as Parara, Kanakaraja, and others. Additionally, creating a column has an aesthetic and symbolic function associated, especially in the diaspora, with celebrating religious holidays such as Diwali. Linked to the latter, Santhuru stresses the moral responsibility of humans to care for the smaller creatures of the world, which he contrasts to the practice of using non-edible flowers that could cause many creatures to die. The moral responsibility towards all being is tied up with the practical significance of drawing a column to provide food for small creatures, which also emphasizes its ephemeral character. Santhuru's text-making unites and reconciles diverse aspects of linguistic, scriptal, cultural, aesthetic, and school-related knowledge and resources with moral and spiritual beliefs drawn from online and offline sources. The faith-inspired text-making opens a discursive space to explore his developing faith identity in highly personalized and unique ways. These identity performances unite what the children have learnt, the moral message of the faith, with the different ways this knowledge can be deployed to make sense of the self and one's understanding of the world and their place within it. In Santhuru's case, this is achieved through a moral stance that emphasizes responsibility and accountability towards all living creatures. Therefore, children come to learn that it is through concrete actions and behaviors that faith identities are enacted and membership in the faith community is constituted. In the ensuing conversation about the scrapbook entry, Santhuru shares a memory from his primary school days, where two classes came together to create a gigantic column that covered the entire floor of a school hall. In his narrative, Santhuru stresses the monumental size of the work that required a range of materials and the energy and skill of two classes to complete the project. The transportation of the column from the threshold of the house to the school hall is an apt illustration of how faith literacies might travel into the mainly secular mainstream school and the majority society more generally. The column the two classes created becomes a syncretic text that unites aesthetic elements from Indian and Sri Lankan cultural traditions with what appears to be a school-based arts project using lots of different colors and materials. The creation of the column embodies tension that is an inherent element of the syncretic process. The making of the column is adapted and transformed in order to fit the school curriculum and context. While Santhuru and Arami evaluate this experience in positive terms, perhaps because of the broader visibility it afforded to the cultural practice beyond the confines of the minority ethnic community, it would appear that this cultural transformation divests the drawing of the column from its moral and spiritual anchoring. The multiple layering of meanings of the column seems to be lost in the school place, and its significance seems to be mainly confined to its aesthetic appeal. This cultural transformation also points to broader societal questions concerning the relationship between faith and schooling, which we can talk, if you like, in more detail during the discussion. So we see our work as contributing to the theorization of faith literacies and identities through a syncretic lens. By examining how the cultural practice of drawing a column and its multifarious meanings were adopted, adapted, and changed when transported in the local London home and school context, we were able to illustrate that faith literacy practice identities are dynamic and evolving. Faith values and beliefs are co-constructed and reinforced in discourse rather than assumed by virtue of co-membership in the faith community. Rather than following a fixed and linear path, becoming a member of the faith community is a process of becoming that is fluid and multifaceted. And finally, we want to draw attention to the dynamics of space, home, school, digital spaces, and how they can actively shape, but also constrain cultural practices and their meanings and possible identity positionings. Thank you very much for listening. And this is just a list of some of our publications from the Beliefs Project and the book that was mentioned earlier in the introduction by Dilys. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lytra. We now go on to our third presenter, Dr. Ana Souza from the Federal University of Goiás. She is a lecturer in English and language teaching at the Federal University, as I've said, and a visiting academic at Oxford Brookes University. Ana's research interests include multilingualism, language teaching and learning in schools, home, and religious settings. Her publications include Portuguese as a Heritage Language, a Pluricentric Perspective, edited with a colleague by Pontes, 2021. Doutora Ana Souza é professora de língua inglesa na UFG e visiting academic na Oxford Brookes University, Reino Unido. A pesquisa da professora focaliza o multilinguismo, ensino-aprendizagem de língua em ambientes da escola, do lar e da religião. Suas publicações incluem Português como Língua de Herança, editada em parceria Pontes 2021. Ana, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Olá a todas e todos. Tenho uma confissão a fazer. Não tenho nenhuma afiliação religiosa. Apesar disso, reconheço a existência de conexões entre língua e religião e considero importante refletirmos sobre essas ligações, inclusive em contextos de ensino-aprendizagem de línguas, como discutirei nesta apresentação. Ressalto que meu interesse nas ligações língua-religião surgiu quando ainda morava no exterior e percebi nas igrejas brasileiras um número maior de crianças de famílias brasileiras sendo expostas à língua portuguesa do que nas escolas brasileiras. Assim, os meus estudos têm sido, em grande parte, conduzidos em contextos de imigração, mais especificamente com imigrantes brasileiros na Inglaterra. Nesses estudos, foquei em grupos cristãos organizados por brasileiros e, pelo menos inicialmente, para brasileiros. Assim, tenho pesquisas com grupos kardecistas, igrejas evangélicas e católicas. Os kardecistas foram os primeiros a terem presença na Inglaterra, onde o grupo pioneiro abriu suas portas em 1992. Hoje, possuem mais de 17 centros espalhados por todo o Reino Unido e atuam dentro de uma rede chamada BUS, a British Union of Spiritist Societies. Apenas 10 anos depois, chegou o primeiro padre católico na Inglaterra. Isso aconteceu porque um padre inglês notou o crescente número de fiéis brasileiros. A Diocese de Westminster, então, passou a receber padres brasileiros que vão para a Inglaterra com visto de trabalho. Os padres convidados atuam na capelania brasileira, a qual atualmente tem 6 paróquias espalhadas por Londres. As igrejas evangélicas também começaram a atuar na Inglaterra no século XXI e formam um grupo de número mais expressivo, são mais de 80 igrejas. Uso os estudos realizados com esses 3 grupos religiosos para adicionar as ilustrações sobre as conexões entre língua e religião iniciadas pelos meus colegas nas 2 primeiras apresentações deste evento. Primeiramente, apresento um estudo que envolveu a evangelização de crianças em um centro espírita em Londres. Ao entrevistar coordenadores e professores e observar algumas das aulas, percebi que a internet tinha um papel importante nas atividades planejadas. Os professores acessavam os planos de aula fornecidos online pela Federação Espírita Brasileira em português e os traduziam. Esses planos eram, então, trocados com outros centros espíritas em países de língua inglesa via internet, isto é, sites específicos criados para este fim. O mesmo era feito com planos criados por eles próprios. Essas trocas caracterizam um exemplo de conexões online com raízes offline. Dessa maneira, o material compartilhado em inglês contribui para a manutenção de crenças e identidades religiosas, ao mesmo tempo que permite a implementação de mudanças no planejamento linguístico desse grupo, que iniciou suas atividades uns 20 anos antes usando apenas português. O início de atividades por brasileiros, para brasileiros, apenas em português, também aconteceu com as igrejas evangélicas. Entretanto, esse grupo passou a incorporar inglês em suas atividades com espaço de tempo muito mais curto. Além disso, são igrejas que passaram a ter uma presença maior na Inglaterra já na época das redes sociais. Consequentemente, além de terem sites na internet, também adotava a comunicação por meio de redes sociais como o Facebook. Assim, tomei conhecimento de que uma igreja evangélica em Londres era filial de uma igreja no Brasil, juntamente com outras 3 filiais, sendo uma em Portugal, outra nos Estados Unidos e uma outra na Itália. Chamou minha atenção o fato das 4 filiais terem páginas diferentes no Facebook. Então, resolvi investigar as escolhas linguísticas que estavam sendo feitas nas páginas do Facebook dos líderes das filiais, onde o português não era a língua oficial, isto é, na Itália, nos Estados Unidos e no Reino Unido. Assim, coletei os posts tanto dos líderes quanto de seus seguidores em 2 momentos, os meses no ano de coleta e no ano de quando as páginas foram criadas. 2 aspectos ficaram claros. O primeiro é que, ao iniciarem suas atividades, as igrejas usavam mais a língua portuguesa. Com o passar do tempo, a expansão das atividades das igrejas, com foco na disseminação para a sociedade local, o uso da língua local, naturalmente, cresce. Ficou claro também que a filial na Inglaterra, por adotar e permitir escolhas linguísticas mais flexíveis, como o uso do translinguajar, levava a um maior engajamento online de seus seguidores. Esses 2 estudos apresentados ilustram a existência de negociações sendo feitas entre 3 aspectos identitários: religião, etnicidade e língua, como visualmente representados pelo que chamo de triângulo Hell. Nele, cada um desses aspectos é colocado em um dos ângulos do triângulo com um contínuo que se move entre suas extremidades. Um movimento em direção às extremidades internas do contínuo indica ligações mais fracas com o aspecto identitário em questão. O triângulo Hell é usado em um terceiro estudo que compara o planejamento linguístico de uma igreja católica brasileira com uma igreja católica polonesa e uma igreja evangélica brasileira com uma igreja pentecostal ganense. Na verdade, é o estudo ligado ao projeto Beliefs, já mencionado pela doutora Vally Lytra, no qual trabalhamos juntas como parte de uma equipe de 11 pesquisadores com foco em 4 religiões, etnias e línguas diferentes. No caso da Igreja Evangélica Brasileira, por exemplo, seu grande foco é na disseminação de suas crenças religiosas para a população local. Assim, o uso de inglês e seus princípios religiosos parecem ser mais valorizados do que as ligações de seus seguidores com o Brasil e a língua portuguesa. Dessa maneira, o uso de inglês está presente em suas atividades. Já a Igreja Católica acredita que a língua comunitária, no caso, a língua portuguesa, possibilita que seus seguidores conectem-se com suas origens étnicas, assim como com suas identidades religiosas. Por isso, o uso de português é valorizado pelos padres e catequistas de crianças e adolescentes, que também veem o apoio aos imigrantes como a missão maior da Igreja. Aproveito para ressaltar que o aprendizado de uma língua envolve interação apropriada e significante, isto é, envolve conhecimento sobre práticas sociais e culturais nas quais a língua é usada. Essa perspectiva de aprendizado de língua é vista como sendo uma socialização linguística. Também é possível falarmos sobre uma socialização religiosa, que envolve o que chamo de letramento de fé, isto é, práticas que envolvem a leitura de textos escritos, como as escrituras, o uso de textos orais, que podem envolver discussões sobre fé, interações com divindades ou outros membros da comunidade religiosa. A performance de fé por meio de ações, as quais podem ser silenciosas ou não. Conhecimento, que pode incluir informações teológicas, geográficas e históricas sobre a religião. Esse foco de Igreja Católica no uso de línguas comunitárias é presente em outros grupos de imigrantes na Inglaterra. A Diocese de Westminster apresenta uma lista de uns 30 grupos de etnias e línguas diferentes atuando nos mesmos moldes da capelania brasileira. Como já mencionado, tive a oportunidade de investigar no grupo católico polonês no projeto Believes, tornando-se letrada em contextos religiosos. O projeto focou na experiência de crianças em ambientes religiosos organizados por e para imigrantes. Ressalto que ambientes religiosos são aqui abordados de maneira abrangente e incluem ambientes familiares, escolares e de adoração. Compartilho 2 imagens analisadas nesse estudo. A primeira é uma imagem congelada de um vídeo gravado em ambiente familiar pelo pai do Adam, a criança participante do estudo. Aqui vemos as interações sociais por meio das quais Adam é apresentado a conhecimento simbólico relacionado a uma celebração pascual tradicionalmente polonesa, o compartilhamento de ovo cozido. A segunda é uma foto que Adam colocou em seu scrapbook e que mostra como ele se apropriou desses conhecimentos. Em outras palavras, fica ilustrado como Adam desenvolve conhecimento simbólico e constrói sua identidade como católico polonês em níveis sociais e psicológicos do processo de aprendizado, como apresentado por Vygotsky. Defendemos que, por meio dessas práticas, crianças desenvolvem a habilidade de lidar com conceitos altamente abstratos. Essas experiências de letramento de fé podem ajudar as crianças a melhor entenderem suas experiências de aprendizado em escolas regulares. Por isso, a importância de práticas educacionais que façam conexões entre as experiências de aprendizado de alunos dentro e fora da escola. Esses estudos me levaram a uma reflexão mais específica sobre as relações entre identidades, religião e ensino-aprendizado de línguas. Então, tendo retornado ao Brasil como professora no Departamento de Línguas Estrangeiras da Universidade Federal de Goiás e orientadora plena e colaboradora sênior no Programa de Pós-Graduação em Linguística da Universidade de Brasília, desenvolvi um projeto com esse foco. Notem que, além de inglês como língua estrangeira, considerando o contexto brasileiro, incluo o português como língua de acolhimento e português como língua de herança no projeto que iniciou em março de 2022. A posição central do inglês como a língua para internacionalização tem um papel importante em seu ensino como língua estrangeira no Brasil. Ao mesmo tempo, o ensino de português tem sido impactado tanto pela crescente presença de imigrantes na rede brasileira de ensino regular, quanto pelo significativo número de imigrantes brasileiros que aprendem português no exterior. O ensino nesses contextos também sofre impacto de políticas educacionais, como as orientações para os programas de formação de professores no Brasil, as quais enfatizam a primordialidade da integração de sensibilização sobre diversidade no currículo, inclusive a diversidade religiosa. A Base Nacional Comum Curricular, que tem unidades temáticas na área de ensino religioso. E os temas transversais que estão presentes nas propostas curriculares para o ensino de português no exterior, português como língua de herança. No âmbito teórico, estudos tanto na área de sociolinguística quanto de linguística aplicada têm destacado a importância da relação língua-religião. Enfatizo 3 aspectos reportados nesses estudos. Tanto língua quanto religião são marcas identitárias, como já falado pelos meus colegas. Em outras palavras, são fontes de como indivíduos se veem e como desejam ser vistos por outros em contextos sociais específicos. Fé e religião podem influenciar o profissionalismo de professores. Aqui, o ensino de inglês por missionários americanos tem sido o foco. Questionamentos éticos e morais sobre o intuito de conversão desse ensino são levantados. Numa perspectiva mais positiva, valores religiosos podem vir a garantir altos padrões de profissionalismo. Apesar disso, existem desafios para a integração de religião no currículo de ensino de línguas. Como exemplos, é possível citar a falta de conhecimento contextual necessária, falta de tempo, orientação e treinamento, assim como a negligência de programas de estudos em relação à integração de fé e aprendizado. Essas barreiras fazem com que a integração de religião no currículo de línguas seja dependente da ação individual de professores. Considerando essas questões teóricas e o contexto de políticas educacionais brasileiras, elaborei um projeto de pesquisa com 3 objetivos específicos. Identificar como autoridades educacionais têm abordado questões religiosas em orientações educacionais oficiais no Brasil e na Europa. Entender a perspectiva de formadores de professores e professores em formação sobre a relação entre religião, práticas pedagógicas e profissionalismo. Examinar os possíveis desafios enfrentados para a integração de religião em currículos de línguas e em programas de formação de professores. Como já mencionado, 3 contextos de ensino de línguas são relevantes para o estudo que compartilho com vocês: inglês como língua estrangeira, português como língua de acolhimento e português como língua de herança. Assim, professores em formação em disciplinas de estágios de cursos de graduação em letras em inglês e graduação em letras português e seus respectivos formadores serão convidados para o estudo. Também serão convidados professores e formadores de professores da área de português como língua de herança em um país europeu, já que não existe formação prévia disponível para este grupo. A pesquisa terá 3 fases de coletas. Será iniciada com uma análise de documentos que guiam a formação de professores de línguas, assim como dos conteúdos de ensino-aprendizagem de cursos de línguas no Brasil e em um país europeu. Os documentos anotados no Brasil e no país europeu serão examinados com o objetivo de identificar se e como religião é mencionada. A análise focará no conteúdo temático dos textos através de identificação de representações sobre religião e educação, isto é, afirmações tanto explícitas quanto implícitas sobre religião nas aulas de línguas. Em um segundo momento, os participantes serão convidados a responder um questionário online. Esse questionário tem como objetivo desenvolver um perfil dos participantes em relação aos seus backgrounds social, religioso, educacional e profissional, e também elicitar suas perspectivas sobre viabilidade, oportunidades e desafios de integrar a religião no currículo de ensino de línguas e programas de formação de professores. Na terceira fase, entrevistas semi-estruturadas serão conduzidas individualmente com cada um dos formadores e professores em formação dos 3 contextos de ensino mencionados. Essas entrevistas permitirão que as questões consideradas relevantes para os participantes no questionário online possam ser exploradas em profundidade. Será um prazer voltar a conversar com vocês sobre esse estudo depois que os dados forem coletados e analisados. Por agora, espero ter despertado o interesse de vocês para o tema e deixo aqui o meu convite para que conheçam melhor não só esse projeto, mas todos os outros trabalhos sendo desenvolvidos pelo grupo de pesquisa Multify. Será um prazer especial receber alunos de graduação e pós-graduação para projetos de pesquisa na área de línguas, identidades e religião. Mas não posso finalizar sem antes agradecer aos meus colegas, o Dr. Andrey Rosowsky e a doutora Vally Lytra, por suas apresentações. A Lana Nunes, pela moderação do chat. A professora Dilis Riz, pela coordenação dos trabalhos. E Luciano Duarte, pelo apoio técnico. Obviamente, sou também muito grata pela atenção de todos os ouvintes e coloco-me à disposição agora para perguntas e para contato futuro pelo e-mail compartilhado neste slide. Mais uma vez, muito obrigada.
Muito obrigada, Ana. Thank you very much. And now we are going to go to our question and answer period. We have a question. Our first question is directed to Dr. Andrei Rozowski, but it is an open-ended question. I believe all three could answer. The question by Zenuji is, do you think that teaching languages through the religious context is an instrument of indoctrination, political or social for the children? Vocês acham que ensino de língua no contexto religioso é um instrumento de doutrinação político ou social para as crianças?
Shall I kick off?
Yes,
That one?
go ahead.
Okay. Well, what a question to start with. But I think the first thing I would say is about there's a very loaded term in your question, Zenilda, which is instrument of indoctrination. Now, you know, what one man's indoctrination could be another person's, you know, education. I think it depends on the individual. Now, what I would say about my own research, and I think, I mean, I hesitate to speak on behalf of my colleagues, but in terms of what sociolinguists do or literacy researchers do, we're there to sort of, if you like, capture what is happening. You know, this is about social phenomena, and or in this case, sociolinguistic phenomena. And our job, if you like, is to sort of account for it in some way. What is happening here, and sort of describing what is happening. Then trying to sort of go underneath the description to say, well, why is that happening? How is that happening? And coming up with some sort of overall sort of a picture understanding of what these linguistic phenomena are actually saying about the participants, what they're saying about the communities, what they might be saying about all sorts of things. And I think I can quite safely say I have no idea whether any of the researchers I've worked with over the past 20 years, whether they are religious or whether they're irreligious or anti-religious, I have no idea whatsoever, because it's not quite the things that we talk about. We're much more interested in sort of like, you know, in the things I've just said. I don't know whether that's true for Vally and Anna, but in terms of taking a stance, if you like, or a position about religion or religious education, that has never really been part of my experience, and I've never sensed it from colleagues either, even though some of my colleagues would be quite serious about their faiths, but it's never really been something that's come into the research, as it were. I mean, I know neutrality and trying to sort of keep a distance is not necessarily always possible, but it's something I guess we strive to achieve. So that's a sort of like preamble, if you like, to your question a little bit. But I obviously, from what I've said and what others have said, you know, and in terms of language and religion, there is a massive sort of connection, you know, and many people have researched into the relationship between the two and how they interact and so on and so forth. And it's very fascinating. It's a very fascinating topic.
Anyone else like to answer this question?
Yeah, just maybe adding to what Andrei is saying, I think it's a great question, because this is an important question within applied linguistics, particularly within ELT, English language teaching. There's been quite a lot of work over the past almost 20 years or so, looking at how and questioning to what extent teachers' faith or religious identities may affect the way they teach, the kind of curricula they teach, or the kind of curricula that they devise, and the relations that they create with their students. So there's quite a lot of work kind of in this field, and it seems to be quite a contentious one. There are scholars who claim that teachers' religious identities have a very detrimental role in language teaching. Others who have tried to show in what ways teachers leverage their religious identities, like other identity aspects associated with gender, with ethnicity, and how these shape the kind of teaching and learning arrangements. I think what we are still missing is more ethnographic, more empirical studies about what's actually happening in schools and classrooms, and looking at interactions where perhaps not only teachers but also students. Sometimes students bring their religious or faith identities into the mainstream classroom as sometimes as a tool to make sense of literacy, make sense of a particular text, for instance, that they're working on. So it's a very interesting and very contentious area of study. So if you're interested in looking into it a bit more, I would certainly recommend having a look at Bill Johnson's book on English language teaching and evangelical mission that was published in 2018, which looks at, it's an empirical study. So what's actually happening in a school that has a sort of a Bible-based curriculum, and how teachers and students navigate this Bible-based curriculum to get a sense of what's actually happening in the ground. So
yes, could I add something? I excuse myself for speaking Portuguese again, also because I'm going to touch on the same things that Andrei and Vally have already mentioned, so I think it's okay if they don't really follow what I'm saying em português. Mas, basicamente, eu acho que o que a gente está mostrando é que existe o trabalho do Andrei, da Vally, o que eu fiz também no exterior, não era um trabalho de estar julgando o que acontece em relação à língua e religião. O nosso trabalho é de entender o que acontece nesses contextos, né? Porque a gente não pode negar que eles existem. Então, estando no contexto da Inglaterra, com muitos imigrantes, a gente sabe da existência de todas essas escolas suplementares, que as crianças frequentam essas aulas, inclusive as crianças de famílias brasileiras. Então, as nossas pesquisas são etnográficas, são qualitativas, para entender os benefícios que essa experiência fora da escola traz e que deveria ser reconhecida e levada para dentro da escola regular. Como a gente já falou, né, de letramento, formação identitária, são experiências positivas, sociais e culturais que essas crianças têm em contextos religiosos. Esse é um grupo, né, de pesquisadores, um grupo de pesquisas nesse sentido. Então, que essa tentativa de não estar julgando se o que acontece lá é certo ou errado, é entender que essa experiência existe, entender como ela acontece e quais são os benefícios que nós, professores em escolas regulares, e até a comunicação das escolas com as igrejas, como isso pode acontecer de maneira positiva para essas crianças. E a outra questão é o que a Vally levantou, que são os estudos que têm acontecido muito nos Estados Unidos, com professores evangélicos americanos, né, os missionários que vão para o exterior, vão para a África, vão para a Ásia para ensinar inglês como parte de uma igreja, muitas vezes como voluntários. E daí acaba tendo essa conexão que acho que é um pouco mais relacionada ao que a Zenilde perguntou, né? Eles vão ensinar inglês, mas, na verdade, eles estão também ensinando religião. Então, existe, sim, o próprio livro que a Vally citou, o autor, ele também não segue, né, não é filiado a religião nenhuma, e existe esse questionamento. Então, tem estudos falando sobre isso também, questionando esse profissionalismo, como eu citei quando eu falei da minha nova pesquisa, né? Mas eu, lendo um desses trabalhos que eu achei interessante, da Manka Varghese, que ela fala muito, é que essa questão vira muito, né, fica complexa e problemática quando a gente fala de religião. Mas, na verdade, nós, professores, levamos todos os nossos outros posicionamentos para a sala de aula, né? Posicionamento em relação a gênero, posicionamento político. Então, por que religião é tratada diferente? Também acho que é uma pergunta que a gente tem que fazer. Por que as outras identidades são trazidas para discussão e a identidade religiosa não? Então, também eu acho que seria um outro espaço que a gente deveria explorar, mas lembrando que as pesquisas etnográficas, elas não estão fazendo julgamento do que acontece, elas estão tentando entender o que acontece da perspectiva do participante.
Muito obrigada, thank you. A nossa segunda pergunta é do professor Alexandre Badin e é para o Dr. Rozowski. If I understood it correctly, so when a child experiences what you gave as an example, Muslim prayer, would that be some sort of liturgical language and that is necessarily ultralingual? Então, vou fazer uma pequena tradução primeiro. Se eu compreendi corretamente, quando uma criança vivencia uma oração muçulmana, isso seria uma língua litúrgica e que necessariamente é ultralingual.
Okay, it's a good question, and there's lots of variables. So it's not easy to give a straightforward answer to that question. It depends on the multilingual context in which that child is in, and which context they're in. For example, a Muslim child who is an Arabic first language speaker would have much more sense of what they are reciting in their prayer than would a non-Arabic speaker Muslim child, okay, if you see what I mean. But on the other hand, prayer itself needs to be defined, because in the Islamic tradition, and I would assume in other traditions as well, there are formal ritual aspects of prayer, and there are more personal, emotive aspects of prayer. And it's fairly common for those more ritualistic aspects of prayer to be in the sacred language, and the more personal, emotive sort of utterances or prayers to be in just the vernacular, because in a sense there's more intimacy in terms of addressing a deity or addressing God or whatever context you're in, if you do that through your own language, the language that you actually communicate in. However, as I was saying in the presentation, in many religious traditions, there is alongside that, there is the sacred language practices, which tend to be more formal, more ritualistic, but nevertheless no less important in terms of the general religious practices of that individual, of that community. And even it's not necessary when you say, is it necessary ultralingual? It depends on the individual, because there's like a continuum. There will be people who recite a prayer and not understand a word of it, apart from this ultralingual, in this ultralingual sense I was talking about. But there are others who would, at the other end of the continuum, would have full understanding, if you like. But then there are so many different sort of possibilities in between those two extremes, really.
Thank you very much. Our next question is for Dr. Lytra. Can you talk a little bit more about how you use scrapbooks as a method of data collection and knowledge generation? Então, a pergunta é para a doutora Lytra, perguntando para ela descrever como ela usou scrapbooks na sua metodologia de geração de dados.
Thank you for this question. So I think it goes back to what I alluded in my presentation, that we wanted the children to be active co-researchers in the project. In other words, to play an active role in collecting the data for us, but also providing their interpretations of the data. And the use of scrapbooks have really allowed us to do that. So we were very open. We gave very open-ended remits to the children in terms of creating the scrapbooks. It was up to them what they wanted to include, what they selected and wished to share with the researchers. And that was sort of the first part of the data collection. And then we went through the scrapbooks with the children, if you like, and if you going sort of page by page and eliciting their responses, so why they had chosen particular representations of their faith, what that meant to them, the sort of stories and memories that their text making triggered. And then we were able to, when we are looking at the scrapbooks and trying to make sense of them, it's not only our own analyses as researchers, but also the analyses, if you like, the perspectives of the children with regards to their work. So it was a very important method, if you like, not only for the collection of the data, but also in the way that we were trying to make sense of the data in a more child-friendly and more collaborative way, rather than as us researchers bringing our own analytical lens only to the data to interpret them.
Thank you. And our next question is specifically to doutora Ana Souza. Você não acredita que o estudo de línguas maternas de herança, etc., ligadas a determinadas religiões, teria implicações éticas delicadas e complexas, sobretudo num país como o Brasil atualmente? And in English, the question is about the ethical implications of studying languages linked to certain religions in countries such as Brazil.
I will answer this one in English so Andrei and Vally can follow, because I think it's something that we have not discussed before. And thank you, Professor Alexandre, for the question. And I think it's very timely, because just this morning, I'm in Brasilia, in the capital of Brazil at the moment. And just this morning, we had the news that some images related to Afro-Brazilian religion have been destroyed. We have here a square called Praça dos Orixás. So it's the African gods square. And they have different images of these gods in concrete, because the followers go there for some of the rituals as well. And these images have been destroyed. So there's that discussion of religious intolerance in Brazil that is maybe a heat topic, I would say, at the moment. And I understand the concerns. And one of the reasons that what my proposal is that I'm trying again to understand the perspective of teacher educators, the perspective of teacher trainees, and also understand what, as I said, is being published in documents in relation to religion, because we are very much aware that there is this imbalance or this disconnection of what documents say that you should be doing, because they do advise us to touch on religion in schools, and then how people actually feel about it. And I would say that probably like any other identity aspect, like in relation to race and gender as well, there is the issue of people trying to avoid the topics because they're going to think it's going to be a difficult topic. But then we do not solve the situation by doing that. And my real interest is to understand what are the challenges, what are the difficulties, and maybe even come up with solutions of how can we do that in a way that we do not offend somebody who has a different religion. Because what we cannot deny is that if we are religious, and even if we are not religious, this is an aspect of our identity that impacts on our everyday lives and impacts on us as teachers, impacts on us as students. And in many occasions, the issues are kind of the white elephant in the room, and then we try to avoid talking about it. So I think it's important that we create a space that people can at least reflect on how comfortable they feel about it, and or be able to reflect on what takes place in their lessons that might be related to those conflicts and how to better deal with them. But I totally understand that the concerns, and that's, I'm not advocating that has to be done. I'm trying to understand how those religious identities impact on those players, and if we see things happening in the classroom, how could we deal with that? How could we better prepare the teachers to deal with that?
And our next question, I would say that it came out of Doutora Ana Souza's talk, but I believe all three perhaps could answer it. And it is, if not mistaken, Dr. Ana Souza mentioned something in her presentation about teachers' professionalism when handling religious topics or studies. I'd like to know more about that, if possible. Em tradução, a pergunta busca saber mais sobre o que os palestrantes pensam sobre o profissionalismo do professor lidando com assuntos de religião na sala de aula.
Could I suggest that Vally maybe starts? Because Vally, you mentioned the studies, Johnson studies.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, there is the issue of teacher professionalism and teacher identities is definitely something that has been investigated in the ELT context, English language teaching context. I mean, I mentioned the study by Johnson earlier, but there have obviously been other studies that have looked at how teachers navigate, not only in terms of their professionalism, but also in terms of the way that, the kind of teaching and learning that takes place in the classroom. And certainly, I think what seems to be coming out from our own work and others is that it's very difficult to divorce and sort of leave for both teachers and students their religious identities outside of the classroom. The same way that our gender identity, our ethnic identity, our racial identity, our sort of stances about our politics or sexuality come into play in our interactions. The same way our religious identities or religious identities come into this into the interaction. I think it's unrealistic to expect teachers or students to leave their religious identities at the door of the classroom. But there's certainly more need for more empirical work to look at what actually happens when children bring aspects of their religious belief in the classroom. The example that I gave in our own study was not really looking at what happens when faith literacies travel into the classroom, but we got some inkling of what happens through children's narratives, what they told us about their experiences of religion in their mainstream school. And very often that experience was very superficial. The example I gave with the column, the emphasis was given on the sort of artistic dimension of this design rather than on the symbolic, the multiple meanings that this artifact had for the faith community. So very often what seems to be coming out of the empirical studies is that there is quite a superficial engagement with faith and faith and belief or faith practices in mainstream schools. So it is really about, in many ways, alerting teachers to the need to engage and perhaps become more knowledgeable. I think a lot of the reluctance on the teacher's part may come from their own lack of knowledge of different faith traditions or the faith traditions of their students. So perhaps a good starting point for teachers is to actually find out, the same way that we encourage our teachers to find out about their children's linguistic resources and cultural backgrounds. Perhaps if we think about religion as part of culture, then finding out about children's faith or non-religious beliefs, not only about religious beliefs, but also non-religious beliefs, might be a good starting point. So yes, so that's kind of my sort of two pence to the discussion.
If I could add something quite briefly.
Yes.
I don't know quite how to put this, because in my experience, not only as a researcher but also as a teacher in schools and in universities, and particularly more recently, is that there are different levels of sensitivity, and religious sensitivity is up there, right? Linguistic sensitivity, on the other hand, and not always, if you're a Kurdish speaker living in Iran, it's up there as well. But in general, linguistic sensitivity is a little bit less. And it's and I've always found it an easy way into the question of diversity is to come through language. And I'll give you an example, not from religion. I'll give you an example from my own experience as a director of a very large master's course in the UK, in our university, with over 300 students. And the majority of them are from China. Now, I've been running this course for a few years, and of course it's coincided with certain issues that have arisen in terms of Hong Kong and China and Taiwan and so on. So there are sensitivities, and we are given regular bulletins from the university about how to handle such sensitivities and so on and so forth. But one of my responses has been, when I've been to sort of meetings and seminars about such things, is a nice way in, if you want, a gentle way in to diversity, linguistic diversity, and which is what I do with my own students. That we approach the question of diversity. We don't necessarily look at ethnicity within that part of the world. We look at language, and language allows you to sort of discuss those sort of often sensitive issues, but in a little bit less of a, I don't know, pressure cooker, you know. And I certainly find that with religion as well, that one can approach religious practice through language, and it's got a slightly easier, I don't know if either you would agree with me, but coming through via language allows it to situate belief and practice in a way that it's not neutral. I'm not saying it's neutral, but I'm saying that language puts it in a sort of framework where you don't have to be so, if you like, stressed out about being insensitive. You know, language allows you to do that. But having said that, I do know that there are different linguistic questions in the world which do arouse a great deal of sensitivity. So I don't want to sort of generalize too much on that.
Yeah, if I can add something as well, please.
Mm-hmm.
Is that okay? Yeah, I think another important point to make is the focus on context. And by context, I mean geographical context, or the environment. Is it home? Is it regular school? Or is it a school related to a specific religion? So because I have a feeling that the issues in Brazil will be slightly different from the issues in the UK, and that's to do because of the large number of migrants in the UK with all these different religions. Having said that, we are aware that we do have older groups of migrants in Brazil. So in the south, we do have Ukrainian, for example, at the University of Paraná, studies that the learning of Ukrainian through religion. And now we have this more recent flows of migrants arriving in Brazil, which it'd probably be interesting to see what they are doing about their religious identities that they bring with them. Are they getting organized like the Brazilian migrant groups are organized in the UK now? But so, and also in relation to, if you think about professionalism specifically, I think it will also vary, because you may have, for example, American Christian universities that this is why they have their campi in other countries. They are there linked to the church. So the professionalism issue might come in a different way, or you might have different questions about professionalism there. The question of is it okay for me to teach religion during their course? Well, it is. You are actually openly saying that that's what you are doing. So it's part of the proposal of their group. But at the same time, you have those questions in relation to other groups that might just say, I'm teaching English, and then they're trying to convert the students in their religion. So the point is, there are studies that look into the advantages and disadvantages, or the positive side or the negative side of linking the two. So there are studies that would say, actually, even teachers that are working in a context that's not linked to their religion, but their religious values, their ethical values that they learn through their religion, actually play a very important role in the decisions they make, for example, in marking assessments or supporting students. And it is related to their religious identities. It's not to do with what they learned as a professional. So although we tend, because the feeling I have is that the questions are very much focusing on the negative side of raising religion in teaching and in teaching languages. But there are many examples, and the studies that have been shared here by Andrei and Vally as well, they're examples of how positive, how constructive, how religion can add to the experiences of individuals, children, and teachers in a very positive way. And I think that's what we need to focus on. I think we need to maybe worry a little less and see ways in promoting the positive side of those experiences that people have anyway. We cannot pretend that, people are not religious. It's just there, as Vally said, it's just part of who we are. So.
Thank you very much. I'm going to wrap up this question and answer period because of our time, and we still have the conclusion. And so eu quero agradecer a todos pelas perguntas, eu quero agradecer aos apresentadores pelas respostas. Certamente é uma área muito interessante e que nos inspira a ler, né, cada vez mais e pesquisar cada vez mais sobre esse assunto. Então, muito obrigada a todos. Eu passo a palavra agora para Ana Souza.
Yes, so I'd like to thank again my colleagues, the speakers, Andrei and Vally. I feel very honored to have you with me today. Obviously, thank again the organization team, Alana, Luciano, Dilis, for being here. And I think we've had a very fruitful exchange. And obviously also thank the public for attending and for the very useful and provocative questions that are good for us. I think it's very good. And I close this seminar with the hope that we all meet again soon and that we can continue our collaborations and do further research on the field of language, identities and religion. Thank you all very much. Então, eu agradeço a todos. Mais uma vez, agradeço novamente aos palestrantes, a Vally e o Andrei, por estarem aqui. É um prazer tê-los presente. Eu acho que nós tivemos trocas muito ricas. Agradeço novamente a comissão organizadora, a professora Dilis, a Alana, o Luciano, que tiveram uma participação essencial, apesar de o Luciano e a Alana estarem escondidinhos atrás da câmera, mas, assim, foi essencial a ajuda, o apoio que eles estão nos dando. Agradeço aos ouvintes e eu encerro, então, esse seminário com a esperança que a gente volte a se falar em breve sobre línguas, identidades e religião. E obrigada mais uma vez.